Bible, turn to Nehemiah chapter 2. We're in this book now, in this study for the summer of Nehemiah, and we're talking about bold leadership this summer. And we're going to do this for the next 8 weeks or so and just kind of plow through this book and maybe learn some things about what it means to be a leader. A few weeks ago, a young girl, a college-age girl, went on a trip, and she went to Europe. Her name was Delilah, and she went to Europe and traveled all over Europe, and then flew back to Los Angeles, had to catch a flight from Los Angeles into Phoenix. And apparently the rules are different for different airlines and also different for different places in the world. And one of the things that came up in Los Angeles is that she had 2 oversized carry-ons. And so when she got to the desk that was going to give her a ticket and move her right onto the plane, they stopped her and said, your carry-ons are too big to fit underneath the seat, and so you're going to have to pay $50 in order to put them up in the overhead bins. Well, Delilah had traveled all over Europe, and during that time she had used her credit card. She didn't have a lot of cash, at least, and so she was going to use her credit card to pay the bill. And when she pulled out her card, somehow, because she'd been in Europe and the credit card company didn't know that she was back in the United States, her card had been locked. So she's standing there, and they're saying, you're going to have to go downstairs and you're going to have to check those bags. And she's like, I'm going to miss my flight. And they said, yeah, you are. And that's a bad break, but it's going to cost you $50. You can't get on the plane without the $50. She says, well, I don't have that. And there was a guy that was standing right behind her, and he kind of stepped up to the podium and he said, I'll pay it. And he handed the card to the attendant and paid the $50. And she was just blown away by this guy's generosity and just blown away by this random act of kindness. She didn't know him, and he didn't know her at all. All she knew is that he was really big. And that's because he was a tight end at OU for years and a professional football player for the Bengals and now the Cardinals by the name of Jermaine Gresham. And you'll remember that name if you follow football at all. And he just said, well, I saw that she needed something, and I just helped her. It's no big deal. But she put it out on Twitter and social media and different things, and next thing you know, it went viral, and everybody just thought that was the most awesome thing in the world, that somebody would help this girl with $50 worth of baggage costs. And you know what he said? He says, I would hope that somebody would do that for me if I had a need like that. And the word is that Gresham is a man full of character, and people speak very highly of him. And so it was no surprise to all his friends and the people that he plays football with that he would step up and help this girl named Delilah Cassidy. And she was just blown away. You know, sometimes you insert yourself into situations because you just feel led by God and you really don't have any kind of explanation for it. Think about Nehemiah, for instance. He asked a friend who had come from Jerusalem to Susa, who was visiting him, really 90 years past any time that was important in the history of Israel, at least 90 years. And he asked him, how are they doing? And when he asked that question, how are they doing, his friend told them they're not doing very good at all. Matter of fact, if you look at Nehemiah chapter 2, you'll see here that it says in chapter 1 that those who survived the exile are back in the province and they're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. All because he asked a question. When you are faced with a need, you have 3 choices. You can ignore the need, or you can feel bad about the need and do nothing, or you can step in and be part of the solution. And I suppose that every one of us in one way or another have done all 3 of those. I mean, I have to admit there have been times when I've been confronted with a need and I just thought, not now, no, not now. If anybody else feel that way once in a while? It's inconvenient and it costs money and all of that stuff. So you ignore it. You just keep on moving. But other people feel bad about it, and they're not saying not now. They're saying, I feel really terrible about it, but I really don't want to help. And then other people step in and meet the need. It's a different kind of person like Nehemiah who steps in and meets the need. And he does it by giving his whole life to God and then saying, I want to help my people. I want to be part of the solution. And so at this point in the conversation in chapter 1, he has three choices. He asks the question, how are they doing? They say not doing well, and he could ignore it, or he could feel really bad about it and still keep moving. And because he's got this cushy life as the cupbearer to the king, or he can say, this is a burden and something needs to happen. Last week I said this sentence, and a couple of you mentioned this word that I use, that Nehemiah's heart was wrecked by the answer he got to the question. He couldn't get it off of his heart. He couldn't get it off of his mind at all. And so he prays and he prays and he prays. And when the opportunity presents itself, he steps into the need. I hope we're all like that more than we aren't. But I have to admit, sometimes I'm not like that. I'll see a need and I just kind of move on. And this chapter, in chapter 2, actually chapter 1 and chapter 2, really speaks to me because sometimes I am so busy trying to get somewhere that I don't really pay attention to what's around me. You ever been that way? I mean, people used to say to me, hey, I saw you on the road and I waved to you and you didn't wave back. And they're offended by that. And you know what my answer was for years was, I'm going somewhere and I didn't see you and I'm sorry, and all those kinds of things. But I don't wave at everybody because I'd be doing this all the time instead of driving. But when it comes to real needs that people have, sometimes we need to slow down and dial it back a little bit and ask ourselves the question, can I be part of the solution here? And that's what Nehemiah did. And so chapter 1 and chapter 2 really cover about 4 months worth of time. And during that time, he prays and he prays, and every day the burden gets heavier and heavier and heavier for him to where he just has this heart that says, I want to do something to help my brothers in Jerusalem. And so when the time comes, he's ready. Now, one of the ways that you can tell whether or not a burden is from God or not is when it doesn't let go of you. You ever had that time when you saw something and you thought, I need to help, but maybe I'm too busy or whatever, and it just keeps on you all the time, and you go to bed with it, and you wake up with it, and you think, I should have done something. I shouldn't have just moved on, and it causes this kind of heartburn in you, and you think, man, this is what a man of God would do or a woman of God would do. They would help that person, and I didn't do it. I've had those kind of times, for sure. But for Nehemiah, he had a burden that became a vision. And then that vision became a plan. Now, what is a vision? A vision is a picture of a preferred future. Now, that's not my definition, that's somebody else's definition, but I really like it. It's a picture of a preferred future. And whether you know it or not, no matter how old you are, whether you're young or you're old like me, the reality is that we have all kinds of vision in our life. We have a vision for how our kids will turn out. We have a vision for how our kids will treat other people. We raise our kids with that vision in mind, and we hope that they turn out the way that God wants them to turn out. That's part of vision. We have a vision of whether or not we want to be successful in our vocation or not. And if you have a job and you want to perform in a good way and you want to please your boss, it's going to take some vision. You're going to have to think about a picture of a preferred future. You have a vision every May, at the end of May, for a great summer. You hope it's going to be a really good summer of 2018. And so you plan trips and you go to camp and then you go to camp again and then you go to camp again and then you go to camp and then they drag you out to camp in the middle of July again because that's what makes a great summer, right? And so we're going to have a great summer. And hopefully your kids will think that's great to go to camp. And I know we've already had a week where we had a bunch of our senior high kids. And you know what? It was a great week. And part of the reason it was a great week was because there are people who had vision about that week. And they wanted to have this picture of this preferred future. Some of us have vision about our retirement. Some of us will never retire. But for those of us who do, eventually, we have this vision about how it will turn out. And we don't know exactly if it'll turn out that way or not, and some of it will have to do with money, and some will have to do with health and location and all that kind of stuff. But we have vision. All of us have vision. We have vision for the church. We want to be part of a church that has certain goals and certain priorities and loves God and loves other people and honors His Word and makes an impact in the community. When we were getting ready to put the sign out here, we're getting ready to put the new sign out here, we had to go to the city council. Gary Finn and I did, and we had to ask permission to do that. It was like it was all kinds of red tape along the way. And one of the questions that the city council asked Gary, and I answered it in my head. I didn't blurt it out in the city council meeting, but they said, are you guys going to be here in 10 years or 20 years or in the future, or are you going to leave the community? And I thought it was an appropriate question. And I thought in my head, and I just thought this, I didn't blurt it out, but I thought, you know what? I'm not that guy anymore that wants to look for 40 acres along a freeway and just move at all. Because we have a community here. And we have a place where we can make an impact in this general neighborhood. And I got to tell you, the city council people, they were really, really glad for that answer that Gary gave them. No, we're staying here. We believe in this community. You know what? That's part of our vision. That's part of who we are. And so it's important to understand that we have lots of vision in our lives. Vision doesn't unfold exactly how we think it will unfold over time. But if you have no vision at all, then you really don't have an opportunity for growth. And you don't have an opportunity for hope. And you don't have an opportunity for blessing other people. It seems like this week's been a hard week for people that I know and that Pam knows. We've had one lady that was 35 years old that died on an operating table this week, and we knew her. That's really hard. But you know what? She had a vision, and her vision was to love Jesus with all of her heart. And so when she died, she went to be with Jesus. But then we see and hear news reports of other people who have taken their life, and you think, maybe they didn't have a vision, and maybe they became hopeless. And they struggled with life. So for Nehemiah, he had this vision because it was born out of a burden, and then it becomes a plan. And this is where I want to pick up in chapter 2. And if you'll just kind of follow along with me, we'll kind of read through this and make some comments, and then I'll make some applications at the end. In chapter 1, we read at the very end of the chapter, he says, I was a cupbearer to the king. And then chapter 2, verse 1 says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. You see, a cupbearer was the person who tasted all the food and all the drink, because if somebody was going to assassinate the king, they would take it first and they'd drop dead, and then the king would live forever. Nice job, huh? Except you got to live in luxury and you became very close to the king. And that's what we kind of see unfold here. And so it says, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. 4 months now. He's been praying for 4 months. And this burden is sinking deeper and deeper in his soul. And he is sad. He's brokenhearted about what's happening to the people in Jerusalem and the disgrace that they're under. But it says that he was very careful not to be sad in the presence of the king. You know why? Because if you're sad in the presence of the king just gets rid of you. And I don't have time for that. I need somebody who's going to pay attention to my food, make sure I don't die. And so Nehemiah is not going to be sad in his presence, but the king, they had a relationship enough that the king asked him in verse 2, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." And I thought that really speaks to the relationship that Nehemiah had with the king. And if you'll notice, it says in chapter 1, or actually chapter 2, verse 1, in the month of Nisan. And then in chapter 1, verse 1, it says in the month of Kislev. So there was this 4-month period. And what did Nehemiah do during all that time? He prayed and he prayed and he prayed. And he probably thought he was spinning his wheels, waiting for something to happen because he had a burden. But he wasn't. God was working in the background. I want to say something to you today. Many of you are in that waiting period. Whatever you're waiting for. Maybe you're waiting for better health. Maybe you're waiting for a child to respond. Maybe you're waiting for a better job. Maybe you're waiting for God to do something in your heart that you've prayed about for years and years and years. And I want you to know that Nehemiah shows us that waiting time is never wasted time. It isn't. God is always working. And when you find yourself in a season of waiting, what you and I need to latch onto is that God is working. He's not forgotten about you at all. And if you think about this in the Bible, you see it over and over and over in the Bible, that God promised Abraham a son, and how long did he have to wait for that son to come along? 25 years. That's a long time to wait. And some of you know about that kind of wait. And you struggle with it, and you wonder what's God up to, and you don't have the answers for it, but you should know that waiting time is not wasted time at all. David was anointed to be king of Israel and then sent back out to the shepherd fields and told, "Get out of our way and get out of our hair, and we'll figure out what to do with you later." And if you count out in the Bible, it says that he waited years and years and years before he actually took the position of king of Israel. Waiting time is not wasted time. The Hebrews got out of the nation of Egypt after 450 years, and they got into the wilderness, and they had to wait 40 years. Waiting time is not wasted time at all. I think about Joseph, and you know that I love Joseph and preached through his story. It was 12 years that he waited from the time that he went into slavery until he got a better place to live. Waiting time is not wasted time. Waiting always has its purpose in life. It's the way God works. And so we see in chapter 2, verse 2, this can be nothing but sadness of heart. And then Nehemiah says, "I was very much afraid." What was he afraid of? I think he was afraid of that he would be disposable to the king. And that if he showed sadness or weakness in his heart, that the king would say, "We got to do something like this." Artaxerxes had a reputation of being hard on the Israelites, or the Hebrews at that time. Matter of fact, if you read through the book of Ezra, you'll find out in Ezra chapter 4 that Artaxerxes actually stopped the rebuilding of the wall because he thought that the Hebrews were a wicked people. And then all of a sudden, here's Nehemiah presenting this opportunity to rebuild the wall. And he was really nervous about it. When I read this, I think about the time that I resigned with no job. And I was very much afraid. And you get that way sometimes when you take risks or you think things are going to change. And that's the way it was for Nehemiah. Nehemiah was still an exiled slave, and the king could have had him disposed of at any time if he'd wanted to. And so for Nehemiah, this was all or nothing. I mean, he was all in, and it was a huge risk for him to step before the king and answer the question, "Why are you sad?" He'd hidden it for 4 months and just prayed. But now he has this giant vision of going and rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. And he's waited and he's waited and he's waited. And God has been working in the background. Huge visions from God usually involve some waiting time and always involve risk. You know that, don't you? I mean, it's never a done deal when you're doing something that God wants you to do, where you step out of your comfort zone and push the envelope a little bit. And I bet if we were to tell the stories of steps in this church, we would see that there were times where we had vision and we took huge risks and we stepped out because we trusted that God was a part of that vision. You see, burdens become visions that become a plan. And that's what happens in chapter 2. And so verse 3 says that he outlines the problem. He says, "Why may the king live forever?" And then he says, "Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" And the king said to me, "What is it that you want?" Now that's an interesting question, because the king didn't have to ask the question. He could have said, "Give me my wine and get out of here." But he didn't. They had this relationship going on. And he said, "What do you want?" And then look what happens in verse 4. It says there, "Then I prayed to the God of heaven." He'd been praying every day for 4 months over and over and over again for the opportunity to try to help his people. But before he says anything to the king, he shoots one of those zip prayers right up to heaven. "Okay, God, this is it. This is the moment that we've been waiting for. Help me to say the right things." And then he answered the king in verse 5, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it." Wow. Now this was a bigger ask than just getting some time off. I don't know if you've ever had that opportunity. When I was younger and I worked for my dad in construction and I needed time off for things, I was always nervous asking my boss for time off because it was a summer job, and it's kind of like, he's going to laugh at me and send me back out to do the work. It made me nervous. But for Nehemiah, this was more than just a weekend off. This was a project. This was going to take time. And so it says in verse 6, "Then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, 'How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?' It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time." Now, what I want you to see out of that is that when the opportunity presented itself during that 4 months of prayer, Nehemiah was also planning. And so when the king said, "What's your plan? How long are you going to be gone? What are you going to do?" Nehemiah had answers. Sometimes I've heard people say this, that they are so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. You ever heard that? And I've heard that over the years, and I understand that a little bit, because sometimes people say, "Well, I'll just pray about it and it'll all work out." But here's the king who says, "What's your plan? What are you going to do? How's this going to affect me too?" And it's right for a king to ask that question. And so in verse 6 it says that he set a time. Now we don't know exactly what the time was. We do know that it took 52 days to rebuild the wall, which was an all-time record in the Guinness Book of World Records, I'm sure. I mean, and if we could have seen the wall at that time and the disrepair and the ruin that it was in, 52 days is just crazy how fast that would come. But you know what? He was governor of Judah for 12 years. And because he was governor of Judah, I'm sure that he wasn't necessarily being a cupbearer to the king. And so whatever time that he set out there, he had a plan, and that was what the king needed to see is that he was thinking beyond just praying about it. And so he says, "Would you send me to the city in Judah so I can rebuild it?" And then he asked for more. Look at this in verse 7. It says, "I also said to him." Now, when I read that, I kind of underlined in one of my Bibles the word "also," because, if you're going to ask for one thing, you might as well ask for more, right? I mean, my kids did that all the time. They would figure out where the crack was for me, and they'd keep asking, and the ask would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and I go, whoa, wait a minute. If you're going to ask all of those things, then the answer is no. And when I would say no, the kids figured out over time that what that meant was not now, let me think about it, and then I'll decide whether I'm going to say yes or not. And so if my kids came in and they said, "Dad, I need an answer right now. I'd say, I'll give you the answer right now. No. The answer is no. And then they would be frustrated about that. And as they figured out that if they just walked away and let me think about it almost every time, I would go, okay, I've thought about this. The answer is yes. And here you go. Well, look what Nehemiah is asking for. If it pleases the king, in verse 7, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? Make sure I can get safely to Judah. And that was another ask, but it wasn't that huge of an ask. But here's the big one. In verse 8 it says, and may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence that I will occupy. So what is Nehemiah asking for? Send me with letters that get me there, number one, and take your number one lieutenant person who happens to be over all the timber, and he needs to pay for it and give me all the timber I need, not only for the gates, but for the walls and for the house that I'm going to build for myself. Now that's a huge ask, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot there. But 4 months of praying over and over and a burden that becomes a vision, that becomes a plan, he was going to ask for everything right up front. I don't know if he really thought he was going to get it all, but he asked for it. And then it says in verse 8, it says, and because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. Now what I love about that is, who gets the credit for this? God does. He says, this isn't my doing, and I'm not that smart, but God is in this burden that's become a vision now, that's become a plan, and because he's in the middle of it, he's going to get all the glory. And I'm going to tell the king that. Now, the king wasn't necessarily a godly man at all, and I'm sure that he probably heard that and thought, yeah, your God thing, I understand all that. But here's Nehemiah saying, I'm doing this for God. And so he went to the governors in verse 8 of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. And the king also sent army officers and cavalry with me. So he's asking for safe passage. He's asking for timber. He's asking for the king to pay for it. And not only that, he also sends officers and the cavalry with him. Nehemiah's got a good thing going here. And you would think, man, this is all unfolding. The burden's becoming a vision. It's becoming a plan. They're going to have a wall soon. The people are going to be happy. But look at verse 10. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. In other words, when you have a burden, when you have a burden that becomes a vision, that becomes a plan, the one thing you can count on is there will be opposition if it's of God. There will always be somebody who will say, stop, I don't want you to do this. And for Nehemiah, it was Sanballat and Tobiah and a couple other people that we'll read about in a few weeks here. So the burden now is transferred to a vision which has produced a plan. And this plan is unfolding perfectly except for the opposition. I'm going to reveal my age here just a little bit. When I was growing up, and one of the favorite shows that I liked watching in the 80s was this story of this team that went out and did great things, and a lot of times it was a lot of crazy things that they fought the bad guys and all that. It was a show called The A-Team. Remember The A-Team? You know, Mr. T. Someday I'll dress up as Mr. T and say those things. I'll have to watch the shows over and over. Well, what I really like about it was the leader of that team would always be known for saying, I love it when a plan comes together. Remember that? Well, I think that's what Nehemiah was saying here was I love it when a plan comes together. Now, we're going to see how it doesn't all come together very well, and that there is opposition, and there's difficulty, and there's hard times along the way. But we've got these bad guys, and we got Nehemiah the good guy. And so Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem. Look at verse 11. It says, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. When a burden becomes a vision and then becomes a plan, you don't have to go around bragging about your plan. Instead, just execute what God calls you to execute. And that's what Nehemiah did. He didn't blow into Jerusalem riding in on his white horse and say, I'm here to save the day. As a matter of fact, he investigated and he looked around and he paid attention to what was going on, and he didn't thump his chest and he didn't pat himself on the back at all. He just waited for God to unfold all that. And I think that's really speaks of his maturity and his faith. There are three things that Nehemiah did when he went to Jerusalem. First of all, he was ready, wasn't he? When the king said yes, he went to Jerusalem. So he was ready for that. Once he had permission, he went. He didn't hem and haw around. He didn't dilly-dally around. He went because he'd been prepared through this time of prayer. And then it says that he entered Jerusalem quietly in verse 12. It would have been so tempting to write in and go, I'm here to save the day, but he didn't do that at all. And he didn't bring a large contingent, it seems. He just surveyed the damage and made an assessment of the need that needed to be done. And he even did most of it under the cover of darkness, because he didn't really want anybody to know right then until God was ready to reveal what the plan was. Why was Nehemiah so secretive at that time? Well, one of the reasons he was secretive was I don't think he really understood what the scope of the work was. And that's why he investigated it for several days, to kind of see what was going to be involved in rebuilding this wall. But he also needed to know who the people were that were going to join him in rebuilding the wall. You see, he didn't go there to actually rebuild it by himself. He went there to pick up the spirits of the people who had been disgraced and give them a project to do where they could get a win. And that win would not only protect them with a wall, but it also would build them up as a people who had been beaten down for decades and decades and decades. And so he wanted to know what he was getting himself into. You know, it reminds me a little bit of what happens in church. A lot of times people come to church and they come week in and week out and they think, well, all the plans of the leaders and everything just kind of unfold. But unless you're involved in the leadership of the church, and this can happen in ministries, it can happen with elders, staff, it can happen in all kinds of different ways, you need to know that the leaders of this church are thinking 6, 12, 18 months in advance. They're thinking about what is next. They're thinking about what does God want us to do, and it takes time to get that from a burden to a vision to a plan. Our church leaders right now are thinking 2019 and 2020 and 2021. It's hard for me to even say those. I just can't believe how time passes so fast. But the leaders of this church are thinking about what is next, but not in 2018, but beyond that. Because that's what good leaders do, for sure. So he was ready to go to Jerusalem, and then he entered quietly. And then the last thing is he engaged other people. Look at verse 17. It says, I said to the people, actually verse 16, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as of yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. And then in verse 17 it says, then I said to them, which would refer back to 16, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and we will no longer be in disgrace. You know what that is? That's a vision. That's a burden that becomes a vision. And now he's letting other people know about it. And then he says in verse 18, and this is very important, you can't let this go by without calling attention to it. What he told the king, he told the people. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. In other words, let me tell you the story of how this all unfolded and went from being a burden to a vision to a plan. And you know what that does for people who are following a leader? It elicits within them confidence. Because they know that he has thought about this and that God is leading in this. That it's not just something that he cooked up in his head at all. And so he engages others. And I want you to notice one other thing in verses 17 and 18. It says, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. You know what? It wasn't about him. It was about them. And that usually is one of the descriptions of a God-sized vision, is that it's not about the leader, it's about the team, it's about the others that engage in this. And here he is bringing them into the vision and saying, the vision that God has given me is now our vision. Let's rebuild the wall. Let's do it for him and do it for us. It's not about me riding in on a white horse. And I really like that about Nehemiah, because he reveals that it's us and it's we and it's you. He doesn't talk about me and he doesn't talk about I all the time. And you can tell a lot when you listen to somebody, can't you? If all they do is talk about themselves, and if all they do is say, I did this, and I do this, and I will do this, and you hear I, instead of you, we, us. You know what? That may not be a vision from God if it's all about them, instead of it being about God and the people. And so it must have been incredible for the Israelites to hear that. We're going to rebuild the wall, and we are going to do it together, especially when they had been in exile for decades and decades and been under the heavy thumb of other rulers along the way. You see, Israel at that point probably felt very abandoned by God, and they felt lost. But what they didn't understand is what we're trying to learn from Nehemiah, in that waiting time is never wasted time. And God was working. So we've got this burden that becomes a vision and then becomes a plan. And I just want you to know that if you've got a vision for something in your life, that's a good thing. I think about Jim Collins, who wrote the book Good to Great. And one of the principles in that book was begin with the end in mind. When you see down the road and then you try to work back, you can develop vision. You can have vision for your employment. You can have vision for your family. You can have vision for your health and wellness. You can have vision for your church. We need vision. And we need it for our own personal lives, and we need it as a church. Helen Keller once said that the only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. And isn't that true? That is so true. You ever know anybody that had no vision for their future at all? So as I was rummaging around in this message this week and thinking about it, one of the things that came to my mind that I kind of struggled with is how many times in certain seasons of my life I just live hour to hour and day to day. You ever do that? You're just hoping you get through the next hour, or you're just hoping you get through the next day. But God is big, and God sees beyond the next hour and the next day, and he wants us to develop vision that comes from a burden, and then we can develop a plan. So I want to encourage you to use this summer, especially, as a summer when you might dream about your life, and you might dream about your relationships, and you might ask yourself the question, what is the picture of the preferred future for me? And you take these 3 months, or for us. Maybe it's your family. As a matter of fact, one of the phrases that I used last week, and it was brought up to me this week, is that this summer might be a summer of clarity for you. And maybe you walk out of August of this year with a different view of what your life is going to be like as God has revealed some things to you. Now, you got to seek it. You got to look for it. You've got to talk to God. You've also got to be committed to not settling for what is, instead striving for what could be. Now think about that. If you live only hour to hour and day to day, then you're just going to live for what is. But if you're the kind of person that sees out there and has an expectation for something better, then you're going to strive for what could be. I like what Andy Stanley says. He says, what could be and should be can't be until God's ready for it to be. Now, that should be on the screen. All right, I think it's on the screen. Is it on the screen? I did not put it in the notes. So I'll send it in an email to you, okay, this week. What could be and should be cannot be until God is ready for it to be. In other words, God is in the middle of that. That whole idea of moving from a burden to a vision to a plan. So how do you develop vision in your life? I'm going to give you 3 things. You can fill in these blanks. They're easy and they make sense. First of all, prepare well. Prepare well. You know, that's what Nehemiah did. Nehemiah was prepared to stand before the king. He had thought about this and prayed about this and planned, and he had lived his life the right way, so that when he went before the king knew about his integrity and his character and his purpose in life, and he was willing to listen. Nehemiah had shown up for work every day and had done what was expected of him, but I suspect that Nehemiah had done more than what was expected. If I could speak to young people just for a minute, if you'll just listen, tune me in for just a second. And young means anybody under 100, okay? Listen to me for a second. One of the things that my parents taught me, especially my dad taught me, is work harder than you need to. Stay longer than you have to. Make impressions on people and do a better job than what's expected of you. Because when you need grace, then it will be available to you. And I really think that's a principle that I know I've tried to live with that in my life and instill that in my kids. That if somebody says, this is how hard you need to work, I just want to work a little bit harder. And if this is what the hours are, maybe I work 15 minutes. Or, here's an idea, just show up on time. Every day. Be known as a person that shows up on time and works the full day. Because when you need to go to your boss and you need to say, you know what, there's a family emergency and I need to get on a plane and fly to Oregon and spend some time with my parents, I don't want to have an argument right there. I just want the people that are in charge of me to say, you know what, go do it. Because they know my heart. They know I'm not trying to take advantage of them. And so young people, when you get jobs and when you spend, all this time investing in people, just remember that. Work harder than you need to work and stay an extra 15 minutes, and you never know where that might pay off down the road. Can I get an amen on that? I mean, we all agree with that. We've seen it in our life for sure. And I will guarantee you this, you will need grace in your life. And you will need somebody to step up for you. And the best way to get somebody to step up for you is just to not do just what is expected, but to do just a little bit more. People who cut corners or do just exactly what is expected but don't go any further than that rarely get the extra glance later at all. I'm not talking about overworking, and I'm not talking about being obsessive and that kind of thing. I'm just saying, do a little more. Because someday you're going to need those people in your life. Sow seeds of trust with your boss. Young people, sow seeds of trust with your parents. When your parents say midnight's the curfew, get home at 10 till midnight. Just do it every time. You never have to worry about being late. Or the time when one of my kids was late and I had all the lights off in the living room and I was sitting in the chair and they walked in and I said, "You're late." It's kind of a come to Jesus moment for him, because I waited and I didn't like him being late. And you know what? He was never late again because he figured it out. Here's the second thing. Prepare well, but then pray diligently. Pray diligently. You see, when you have a burden, one of 2 things can happen. You can either give it to God or you can let it eat you up. And I think Nehemiah gave it to God. It may take time to work everything out, but God is working because waiting time is never wasted time. So don't stop praying when you have a burden. And don't give up on how God might use you to meet that burden. Here's the last thing. Plan according to God's will. Plan according to God's will. Nehemiah had a plan, and it had to be executed. But the plan came together because he had prayed. And he had prayed and he had prayed. What was that plan? I need a leave of absence. I need safe passage. I need you to pay for the project. You think, wow. And then I need the people that are there to be ready to work. And guess what? God blessed that plan. And we're going to see that through the rest of this book. Proverbs 16 has been on my mind this week, and I've been reading through it every day. It's got some really great stuff in it, but two verses that really jumped out at me according to this sermon were these verses. In Proverbs 16, verse 3, commit to the Lord whatever you do, and he will establish your plans. You know what? Whatever the burden is that becomes a vision and becomes a plan, I think you want God in the middle of that. And so commit it to the Lord. And whatever you do, and he will establish your plans. And then in Proverbs 16:9, it says this, in their heart, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. And again, we can think about big plans and big visions and everything, but when it gets right down to it, plans are executed one step at a time. And you never know whether that step's going to go this way or go that way, or whether it's going to go down or it's going to go up. But again, I think in every step, you want God in the middle of your plan. And I hope those verses encourage you, because we want to make sure that we're in the center of God's will, no matter what that vision looks like and no matter how the plan unfolds. We want to make sure that he is establishing us and make sure that our steps are firm. Now it gets kind of interesting from here on out in Nehemiah chapter 3. You can read that this week. I challenge you to read it. I challenge you to read every word of Nehemiah 3. And most people skip Nehemiah 3. But I'm going to preach Nehemiah 3 next week. And we're going to talk about what it means to be part of a team. Okay? Would you stand, please? If you don't leave here with anything but this week, leave with this. Waiting time is never wasted time. And burdens that are from God become visions, which then eventually evolve into plans. Make sure God is in the middle of your plans. Now, Father God, I ask you this morning just to use these words to challenge our heart and to think about this summer, God. And maybe this is the time when things are just a little bit different schedule-wise, that we can pull back and think about your work in our life. And maybe it can become a summer of clarity for us. We pray that that would be true for the church, but also be true for our families, be true for our businesses, but also true for us. That maybe we would walk out of this season, God, with a more clear picture, a picture of a preferred future, what we call a vision that leads to a plan. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.